Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb, I want to thank you for tuning in to this evening's virtual Roosevelt House program. While we hope to be back in person again soon, we've decided that for now, the best way to serve our audiences is to return, briefly we hope, to virtual programming. We're delighted that so many of you are tuning into tonight's discussion, which is an indication, I think, that probably we've made the right decision for now. And we're pleased, just like the Roosevelt era ambassadors to Europe, whom we will be exploring tonight, that we're able to serve from a distance. Before we begin with the introductions, just a note on how exactly the program will run in case you've forgotten the procedure that we all got accustomed to, sadly, last year. At any time throughout this evening's discussion, feel free to type any question you'd like to pose to our guests into the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. After about 40 minutes of discussion, programming curator Mac Barrett will magically appear on screen and facilitate the Q&A part of the program. And remember that you can always use your Zoom function as well to order a copy of the book we're discussing tonight from our official bookseller, Shakespeare & Company, complete with a book plate signed by our featured author. As you all know, while we continue to navigate the challenges of today with our programming, we are gathering tonight, as we often do, for a program that looks back at another of our country's and the world's most existential challenges, or rather, in this case, its prelude, and that is the period leading up to World War II. While policymaking of the present remains the key focus of Roosevelt House, so too do the policies of the past that have shaped modern times. And tonight, we're considering the policies pursued and proposed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's ambassadors to major European nations in the run-up to global war, how they differed and how they conflicted, and how FDR struggled to juggle input from his ambassadors to plan America's role in the imminent global conflict. With penetrating research and page-turning storytelling, the book under discussion tonight, Watching Darkness Fall, FDR, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler, breaks new ground in how we think about America's approach to the war and the way in which that approach continues to shape our role in foreign affairs to this very day. It's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual Roosevelt House stage the book's distinguished author, Ambassador David McCain. The U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg during the final year of the Obama administration and former director of policy planning for the State Department, his extensive career in public life also includes service as CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, staff director for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and director of policy and planning for the State Department under Secretary John Kerry. That is quite a CV. He's currently a senior fellow at the nonpartisan think tank, the German Marshall Fund of the United States. The ambassador's previous authored books and co-authored books, all imbued with an insider's sensibility for international diplomacy, include Partners of First Resort, America, Europe, and the Future of the West, Friends in High Places, The Rise and Fall of Clark Clifford, Tommy the Cork, Washington's ultimate insider from Roosevelt to Reagan, and Suspected of Independence, The Life of Thomas McCain, America's First Power Broker. The subject, I was fascinated to learn, being not only a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but one of Ambassador McCain's own ancestors. To chat with our author tonight, we're very pleased to welcome back our friend and colleague, Hunter College history professor Benjamin Hett, an award-winning author in his own right. Ben's books include The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War, The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power, and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, and Burning the Reichstag, an investigation into the Third Reich's enduring mystery. As you doubtless know, if you're a frequent flyer on our programming in person or online, Ben has been featured here at Roosevelt House a number of times to discuss his own works, as well as to serve as moderator to explore the works of others, especially when it pertains to World War II and the World War II era. Tonight, he helps form an expert duo with the ambassador, two historians who shed light on one of the darkest periods in world history. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin Hett in conversation with Ambassador David McCain.
Well, thank you, Harold, very much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. And David, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome you, at least virtually, to Roosevelt House. I'm delighted to have you here and delighted to have a chance to talk about this book, which, as Harold said, really is a page turner. If I may, I'd really like to start with a question that sort of brings in your own background, because of course, as we know, you have a really long and distinguished record in public life, in domestic as well as foreign service. And I think one thing we'd all be really interested to hear about is, how do you think your own experiences in these areas have shaped how you wrote this particular book?
Well, thank you. And thanks, Harold, for the kind introduction. And I also want to thank Roosevelt House for hosting us tonight. I appreciate it. I wish we were in person, but that is life these days. And I'm glad we're able to do this. And Ben, thank you very much. And thanks for the question. So, you know, I think first of all, as an ambassador to Luxembourg, it's actually one of the, I think, one of the reasons that I wrote this book. You know, Luxembourg is a very, very small country. You have to have a very large map to find it on the map, on the map, because it's so small. But it's bordered by the Netherlands, by Germany, by France, and it was an original member of the European Union and an original member of NATO. It is really at the center of Europe in many ways. And it was overrun twice by the Nazis. And while I was there, I participated in a number of ceremonies at Hammes Cemetery, which few people know is the second largest U.S. military cemetery in Europe. It's actually where George Patton is buried. And Patton's widow happens to be from my hometown in Massachusetts. And I became very interested in World War II while I was there. And I sort of, began to sort of think about what it must have been like for the ambassadors who were serving in those countries around Europe during the rise of Hitler, and what it must have been like for them. And obviously, again, having been an ambassador, I was sort of fascinated to learn about how they interacted with the State Department at the time, because it was obviously such a different era.
That's something else I was really curious about, because I certainly, to put it mildly, do not have your experience in recent public life, but I would assume that the diplomatic corps now is much bigger and probably more socially diverse than back in the 30s, when basically everybody went to Groton and Harvard, it seems. So I wonder how you have reflected on how both the conduct of American diplomacy is different now than in the 1930s, and also the relationship of foreign policy to domestic policy, if you see big changes there since the 1930s.
Sure. So, again, in the 1930s, we were a decade or so away from World War I. America was in a very, as you know, Ben, in a very isolationist mood at the time. President Roosevelt, when he campaigned for president in 1932, he did everything he could to avoid talking about foreign policy. He actually repudiated the Treaty of Versailles at the time. Foreign policy just was not a terribly important issue for most Americans. And don't forget, this is the height of the Great. Hoping that this will solve the problems.
Okay, so far that's sounding pretty good.
Okay.
Let's see how we do. Okay. All right, David, I was asking you about the four sort of main players in your book. You focus chiefly on Breckinridge Long, William Bullitt, William Dodd, and Joseph P. Kennedy, with a little bit of sort of, I don't know if cameo is the right word, but other people who were important advisors for FDR come in a little bit too, Sumner Wells, of course, and Harry Hopkins. But I wonder, just maybe taking the four ambassadors to start with, can you just tell us a little bit about these very, very colorful people?
Sure. Let me start, actually, if I can, with William Dodd, because again, Roosevelt, I think, understood that Germany would be an important player in Europe in the future, and he wanted a top flight ambassador. And he actually, as many of you know, Roosevelt had run for president in 1920 on the Democratic ticket, and the presidential candidate had been Democratic nominee had been James Cox. And Roosevelt actually asked him if he'd like to be the ambassador to Berlin, and Cox turned him down. He asked 2 or 3 other people, and they all turned him down. And eventually he was in a cabinet meeting, and his Secretary of Commerce said, well, there's, this fellow, William Dodd, who was the chairman of the history department at University of Chicago, and he speaks German. And Roosevelt had met him and said, well, that sounds terrific. And so he called him up, and he, much to Dodd's surprise, he said, I'd like you to become my ambassador to Germany. And Dodd he literally was, he was very surprised. He was obviously very honored. He was, he had no diplomatic experience, never served in government, really didn't know much about American politics or German politics, but he spoke German. And he was confirmed on a voice vote in the United States Senate, never even had a hearing, and off he went to Germany. And just very briefly, I think he went with very much sort of an open mind about the German government. And after, at that time, Hitler had not completely solidified his power in Germany. But after he did, and after a few meetings that Dodd had with him, Dodd recognized and realized that Germany was on a very, very dangerous course. And he communicated that to Roosevelt on a regular basis. Breckinridge Long was a graduate of Princeton. He hailed from a very prominent family that were known as a Confederate aristocracy. John Breckinridge, who'd been the vice president under James Buchanan, was his ancestor. And Roosevelt had gotten to know him during the First World War when their offices were down the hall in what is now the old Executive Office Building. And Roosevelt liked him. And Long had actually run for the Senate twice in Missouri and been defeated, but he was something of a political animal, and he was a very astute political operative. And he actually managed some of the floor during the 1932 campaign, during the convention in 1932. And so Roosevelt wanted somebody who had some political smarts, and somebody he liked. This was somebody he trusted. So he appointed him as ambassador to Italy. And Long was quite a wealthy man, and he immediately bought a beautiful house that became the residence, and to this day is the residence in Italy. He was very taken by Mussolini. Very impressed by Mussolini. And I might add, however, that Roosevelt had high hopes for Mussolini as well. But if you read some of the early letters that Long wrote, first of all, instead of addressing Roosevelt as Mr. President, he said, "Dear Frank." He wrote, "Dear Frank." So they were clearly pretty good friends. I don't think there was any other ambassador that addressed Roosevelt as Frank. And his early letters were somewhat simplistic. He talked about he literally talked about how Mussolini made the trains run on time, and how even though these fascists they all wore black shirts and were very austere, how they created this sense of order for the country, and he admired that. He would go on to have a very, and we can talk about that a little bit later, I think, to do great damage to the legacy of Roosevelt and to the administration. The third ambassador I write about is William Bullitt. And to me, he's in many ways one of the most fascinating ambassadors that the United States has ever produced. Just an extraordinary man. Had negotiated with Vladimir Lenin, sat across the table from him in 1919 in Paris. He was at that time under 30 years old. Brilliant, just a brilliant guy. And he had become involved in the Roosevelt campaign. Roosevelt had gotten to know him and was hugely impressed by him. And they had a real chemistry between the two of them. And he was someone that Roosevelt wanted as an ambassador. And he became our first ambassador to the Soviet Union. And both Roosevelt and Bullitt had high hopes for that relationship. They soured very, very quickly. And within a matter of months, Bullitt was deeply discouraged and wanted to leave. He was being wiretapped. His phone calls were being listened to. He was being followed. He did not, in the end, have the kind of access to the Soviet leadership that he had hoped for. The issue of reparations was not on the table. So he was very disheartened by that experience. But he later became ambassador to France, which was much more to his liking. And he had something of a mixed record as the ambassador to France, but ultimately, I believe, gave Roosevelt very sound advice. The fourth ambassador is one that I think many Americans are at least familiar with, and that's Joe Kennedy, the patriarch. And he's such an interesting character, and he and Roosevelt had also gotten to know each other during World War I. And during the 1932 campaign, Joe Kennedy had been a big supporter of Roosevelt. He'd given quite a lot of money. And I don't think, well, I know Roosevelt's campaign manager, Lewis Howe, didn't trust Kennedy because he felt that he was somebody who had made money, in the liquor business, and that he was somebody who had gone to Hollywood, and he just didn't trust him. But Roosevelt was a loyal individual, and Kennedy, he believed Kennedy deserved a place in the administration. He made him the first head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And Kennedy, by all accounts, did an excellent job. I mean, the legislation that undergirds the SEC today was written by somebody I wrote about, Tommy Corcoran and Ben Cohen, who were on the staff of Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy really restored a great deal of trust to the financial system at the time. He left after about a year and a half and went back into private business. He really wanted to be Secretary of the Treasury. That was his dream job. And he asked Roosevelt on several occasions to do that. Roosevelt was very reluctant. Henry Morgenthau was somebody he liked and trusted. But he offered Joe Kennedy a second position to be after the SEC. He offered him the position to be the head of the Merchant Marines, which was actually a step down from the SEC. But lo and behold, Kennedy took it. And again, he did a very good job. But at a certain point in 1937, in a conversation with Roosevelt's son, Kennedy told the younger Roosevelt, he said, I'd like to be the next ambassador to the United Kingdom. And when Jimmy Roosevelt went back to the White House and told his dad, the story is they had just had a great laugh about it. That was just a preposterous idea. But as Roosevelt began to think about it over time, over the weeks, he thought, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. The 1940 election will be coming up in a few, be campaigning for that in a couple of years. It'd be good to get Kennedy out of the country. It won't cause any political mischief. And Roosevelt, who never really trusted at least at that point in time, the British, he didn't like the British. He thought they had a superior attitude. Thought perhaps not the worst to have a crusty Irishman there who might shake things up. So he did appoint Joe Kennedy to be ambassador to England, and of course that didn't go particularly well.
Yeah, putting it mildly, I think that's
Right.
fair. You mentioned how Long would write to Roosevelt as "Dear Frank," and how that seems, maybe not the most appropriate way to write to a president, but at least he didn't end all of his letters by telling Roosevelt how much he loved him the way that William Bullitt did. And that's something you made a point of, which certainly really struck me too. But, when I was reading this, I kept sort of running through my mind with each of these people, well, which one is sort of getting it right? Or, how good are these men at seeing what's in front of them? And I think I sort of came to the conclusion that on the whole, Bullitt was the best at seeing what was happening. I don't know if that's your view, or what do you think about that?
Absolutely, it's my view, and I'm glad you came to that conclusion, because I shouldn't read online reviews, but I read online reviews occasionally, and from folks who have read the book, and it's really mixed about that. And a lot of people think I'm unfair to Bullitt and that I didn't like him. And look, Bullitt, as you pointed out, Ben, a lot of his letters to Roosevelt were this sort of filled with this saccharine, romantic verse. I mean, he talked about when he was first in the Soviet Union, how he missed the sharing the evenings with the president and Mrs. Roosevelt, and how he hadn't really had a home for years, and they made him feel so much at home. And then Bullitt had a country estate outside of Paris, and he wrote Roosevelt one time and talked about he's looking at the moonlight over the river. And I mean, just a very sort of strange thing to be telling the president, to be honest. I mean, I found it very, very odd. But he understood how to get things done, and he understood the State Department. He knew that at times, which I didn't fault him for particularly, he knew how to, he needed to circumvent people occasionally, which he did. And he also was absolutely right about what the president needed to do in 1939, which was rearm the United States. And before that, he understood that war in Europe was inevitable. And I should add that in 1940, when Paris was being surrounded and the Germans were just about to occupy it, they were just about to destroy Paris, that Bullitt is actually credited in large part with having saved that city through negotiation. And so I think in many ways he was an extraordinarily talented individual, even if at times he was not likable.
Yeah, and that is a remarkable story too. He was, among other things, remarkably brave in sticking in Paris, making a point of staying in Paris as the Germans were there, which is one of the ways in which I think he contrasts quite significantly with Joe Kennedy, who was pretty keen to not be getting bombed in London. Can't maybe blame him for that, but there is certainly a contrast there. Now, let's just maybe, I'd like to hear your thoughts on a couple of the other people who, especially a bit later, become important influences on FDR's information flow and thinking, and that's Sumner Welles and Harry Hopkins. Can you say a little bit about those two? Sure.
So Sumner Welles, he is a very, very interesting guy. Had gone to, he had sort of Roosevelt's career in many ways. He had gone to, or at least educationally, he'd gone to Groton, he'd gone to Harvard. He was very much from an upper crust patrician family. His family was actually very close to Eleanor Roosevelt. She knew the Welleses better than Franklin did. But Franklin liked Sumner Welles, and when after he was elected president, he actually gave his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, a sheet of paper, and he said, "These are the people I want. I want these people in high positions in the department." And he mentioned Bullitt, and was one of the people he mentioned. He also mentioned Sumner Welles. And so Welles actually did not initially work on European issues. He was a Latin American specialist, and he did a very, very good job for Roosevelt. And so that when the position of undersecretary became available, Roosevelt appointed Welles. Welles was not terribly socially adroit, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Dean Acheson described him how when somebody would enter Wells's office, he would stand sort of awkwardly over his desk and put his fingers on the, sort of on the edge of the desk. And he had this very sort of, deep voice and would sort of greet them, and it was very stiff and awkward. And I think people found him difficult to work with to some extent, but he was incredibly smart. And again, someone who Roosevelt really trusted. And there's a wonderful line that John Gunther has, John Gunther was a journalist at the time. He wrote a book that I think probably most are familiar with, named called Death Be Not Proud, which is a book that I actually read in grade school, I guess. So maybe people aren't familiar with it now, but he was a wonderful, wonderful journalist. And he wrote about how, he said, when there were cabinet meetings and Cordell Hull was presiding, the president would always turn to Hull and say, "So, Mr. Secretary, tell us what's happening." And invariably, Hull would say, "Well, Mr. President, the news isn't very good." And that's not what Roosevelt wanted to hear, or at least it wasn't the only thing he wanted to hear. He wanted to then hear, what are you doing about it? And so the way that Gunther framed it, he said, there must have been 10,000 times where President Roosevelt had wished that his Secretary of State was Sumner Welles, who, when it was asked to present an issue, would do so with great ease, with great dexterity, would give you, an instant analysis that was brilliant, and would always have a recommendation. And so that I think Welles, for a period of time, was in many ways Roosevelt's most trusted foreign policy advisor. And that's something, again, that's a theme in the book, because, in the end, titles didn't really mean that much to Roosevelt. And if he found somebody he thought was competent, he would rely on them for information and analysis and recommendations. And so, for a time it was William Bullitt, for a time it was Sumner Welles, and ultimately it was Harry Hopkins. So that segue to Harry Hopkins for a second. Hopkins is somebody who actually, again, was probably closer in the earlier years to Eleanor. He had worked in Albany when Roosevelt was governor. He came to Washington, but even when Roosevelt was governor, he didn't particularly know the man. He then was put in charge of the Works Progress Administration, and he just did a terrific job. And Roosevelt increasingly was meeting with him, and that was obviously a huge domestic program. But Roosevelt, enjoyed him too, because Hopkins was quick-witted and interesting. And a native of Iowa, had gone to Grinnell College. People described him as having looked as though he'd slept in his suit for 4 or 5 days. Roosevelt liked these sort of, interesting people. And Hopkins was also somebody who, again, he did a trip to Europe for Roosevelt and came back and reported on what was happening. And Roosevelt found his reporting to be very, very incisive. At a certain point, Hopkins became I guess it was in 1939, I think, he became you might know better than me on that one, he became Secretary of Commerce. But he got very, very ill. And he actually moved into the White House and became a resident of the White House. And so Roosevelt was seeing him constantly. And again, he trusted him. And, I don't have many long passages in the book. And I knew you would probably ask me about Hopkins. So I just want to read one quick paragraph. I won't take much time.
Sure.
But it's something that Sam Roseman wrote about. Sorry, not Sam Roseman. It was another speechwriter, Robert Sherwood, who wrote a wonderful book about Roosevelt. And he talks about Hopkins a little bit. And let me just read it quickly. Hopkins naturally and easily conformed to the essential Benjamin Franklin tradition of American diplomacy, acting on the conviction that when an American representative approaches his opposite numbers in friendly countries with the standard striped pants frigidity, the strict observance of protocol, and the studied air of lip curling, he is not really representing America, not at any rate the America of which FDR was president. And that's just, that's just a wonderful sort of commentary on and description of Harry Hopkins. And so, when Roosevelt sends Hopkins to England to negotiate Lend-Lease with Churchill, and by the way, Churchill and Roosevelt were not big buddies at that time, but Churchill immediately is taken by Harry Hopkins, and he forms a bond with him, and he really likes him, and he trusts him, just the way Roosevelt trusts him. And in many ways, that sort of commonality brings the two leaders together. It's such an interesting relationship. So Hopkins is just a marvelous figure.
Yeah, that really comes through. I sort of think on the index of which of the people you're writing about I'd like to have a beer with, probably Breckinridge Long would be at the bottom of the list and Harry Hopkins at the top, I think. I love the moment where he's near the end of his first visit to Britain and he says to Churchill something like, I suppose you're wondering what I'm going to tell the president. And then he quotes the biblical line, whither thou goest. And I find that's actually such a moving moment in this.
Oh, and of course, Churchill, tears are streaming down Churchill's face at the end of that. So it's a marvelous anecdote.
Yeah. All right. So obviously, really at the center of all of this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, I keep pondering this guy. I think he's the most enigmatic of our presidents, maybe. So I'm curious, how do you think, and especially in light of all of your background and experience, could you say how what your sort of evaluation is of how FDR conducted foreign policy in this, obviously crisis-ridden time?
Yeah. So it's even after having written this book, it's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest. Roosevelt, again, I think he came to the presidency not wanting to talk about foreign policy. At the same time, Roosevelt was an internationalist from a young age. I mean, he traveled to Europe many times with his parents as a boy. When he was in the Wilson administration, he traveled to the battlefields of France. So he actually understood what, the havoc and the destruction of war. And he became increasingly interested and consumed by what was happening in Europe over the course of the 1930s. But, to me, Roosevelt is this sort of extraordinary juggler because he is always juggling domestic policy, foreign policy, and politics, to be honest, all three of them. I agree with you. He's certainly one of our most enigmatic presidents, but I also believe he's one of our greatest presidents. That's not a revelation. He did lead us through the Great Depression, and he did lead us mostly through World War II. But he really is this study in contradiction. And again, there's this wonderful quote from Robert Sherwood, the speechwriter, who talks about Roosevelt's heavily forested interior. It's a great phrase, heavily forested interior. Yeah. And I think what it does is it captures the contradictions in Roosevelt's character. He was this wonderfully empathetic individual. He really was. I mean, he cared about people, but could he be unsentimental as well? And he was very much an idealist, and we don't really have time to talk about it. But the Atlantic Charter is which has got a little bit of publicity earlier this year when President Biden tried to sort of resuscitate the idea of the Atlantic Charter. But it is really an extraordinary vision for the transatlantic relationship, and he was a visionary in that way. But he was also, to the bone, a pragmatist. Mm-hmm. And so that, if somebody in his administration wasn't performing the way he wanted to, or somebody crossed him, like Bill Bullitt in the end, he had no qualms about cutting them loose, none. And he was also, an enormously political guy, as I said. He was always thinking about politics and about reelection. And that really formed the basis of his relationship with Joe Kennedy. But Roosevelt was not he was not all about politics. He was an enormously courageous individual too, I think. And I think he recognized, certainly by 1938, that war was inevitable. And I think when he began to call for the manufacture of hundreds of United States Air Force planes in 1939, he understood that at some point the United States was going to have to get into this war. I know people ask all the time, had it not been for Pearl Harbor, would we have gotten involved in the European war? And I think personally, there will always be debate about this, but personally, I think there's no doubt that he would have.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I quite agree with you on that. Now you mentioned, and I think no one will object if we go a few more minutes with our conversation before we go to Q&A, since we had that little glitch. This is so interesting to hear from you. I don't think anyone's going to mind hearing your thoughts a little bit more. So there are a couple of other things I would like to ask you, and that is, so first of all, you referred to Roosevelt being very unsentimental, and that certainly is striking in the book, maybe especially with Bullitt, but with some of the others too. And one thing that struck me when I got to the end is that really almost all of these people, I guess not Hopkins, but almost all of the others, by the end, their relationship with FDR is either bad or non-existent. And in a sense, for different reasons, I suppose, he sort of cuts them all loose at the end. And I'm sort of curious about that. Do you think that's something that's maybe inherent in the exercise of power over a long period of time? Is that sort of a dynamic that's in the process, or does that have something to do with FDR himself? What do you think?
It's a good question. And I don't think I wouldn't put it entirely the way you did, because I do think, for example, I think he hung on to Breckinridge long, a little bit too long.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But in general, look, I think Roosevelt understood the gravity of the situation that he faced. I really do, and that's why I say, I think he was ultimately, that sort of pragmatism and lack of sentimentality they went hand in hand often. And I think that's true today with good presidents as well, or with presidents that make tough decisions. I think you may form a friendship with an individual in an administration, but if they're not performing to the degree you need them to, or there is somehow disagreement that can't be resolved, often they leave, and usually it's for family reasons, but it can be for many things. Trust me.
Spend more time with family. Yes.
Right.
All right. Well, maybe the last thing I'd like to ask you, it's hard to read this book without hearing the echoes. You write about some of the political figures in America in the 30s who were espousing something close to or right on fascism, anti-Semitism, the kinds of crises that are in the world, the kinds of security threats, the refugee crisis that Roosevelt's administration has to deal with. I wonder how to what extent do you think that there are these real parallels between the 1930s and now, or to what extent do you think our predicament looks a little different than in the 1930s?
Yeah, I think it's always dangerous to overdraw the comparisons, but there clearly are some similarities. I do think, today Americans are in a very isolationist frame of mind. Now, it's different because we don't, in the 1930s, there literally were two great oceans that were separating us. And the means of communication was again so much more drawn out and difficult. And today, we are in a globalized communication environment. So we know exactly what's happening on the border of Ukraine and Russia, and we know exactly what's happening in Haiti, and we know exactly what's happening in China. To some extent, not when I say exactly, we don't know the full panoply of issues, but we know what's going on, and that's obviously different. But the frame of mind is quite similar. There's no doubt there's a very, in my view, dangerous streak of authoritarianism around the world, and in this country as well. And whether you're around the world, you're talking about, Russia, China, Turkey, Philippines, there are a number of, Hungary, there are a number of countries which have become more and more authoritarian in recent years, and that is not a positive trend. And so there really is I think, a battle of hearts and minds that we are involved in at the moment. And in terms of, this country, again, I think it's just, we're in a dangerous place. I mean, when you have as many people who don't believe that Joe Biden won the election, I mean, millions of people who will not accept that. To me, it's a very, it's a very, very hard thing to understand. It's interesting too, after, I can't remember what happened in 2020. I can't remember what exactly precipitated it. It may have been the former president's visit to St. John's Church with the Bible, but in his explanation afterwards. But, I remember General Milley sort of saying that it was sort of a Reichstag moment. At some point, he was talking about that. And it's interesting because he was talking about 1933, but in 1934, when there was actually the purge of the Nazi Party, Hitler spoke to the Reichstag, and he has this sort of extraordinary quote, which I don't know if I can find, but it stood out to me. Let's see if I've got it here. I don't think I do have it, but he essentially said, I did this because it was a moment in our country's politics where I needed to step in and take control of the rule of law, and I alone became the Supreme Court at the time. He literally says something to that effect. You may know the quote better than I do.
I think, as I recall, you've got it right on.
Yeah. And wow.
Yeah.
I alone, I mean, the sort of narcissism that goes with so many authoritarians is worrying, to say the least.
Yes. Well, there are many, many more things I would like to ask you, but I think maybe on that slightly gloomy note, let's throw it open to the audience and give some other folks a chance to bring in some questions for you.
Hello, thanks. I have some questions from the audience. I'll read to you now. The first comes from our good friend and editor of The Nation, Katrina vanden Heuvel. She begins by quoting you, Ambassador. Ambassador Dodd made the arbitrary and totally unrealistic suggestion that the State Department should employ no more than 2 millionaires at any one time. So her question is about Ambassador Dodd. How did his daughter Martha's life in Berlin influence his experience, cables, letters, insights?
Okay. So a couple of things on that. The reason I felt that Dodd was not being terribly realistic was that, again, the State Department at that time was filled with very rich people. Roosevelt referred to the State Department as the striped pants boys. And he actually didn't like the fact that so many of them were Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. He wanted a more diverse foreign service. He told one of his aides at one time that the department was full of dead wood. And Roosevelt was somebody who believed that, you were on this earth to make your mark. And he felt that many people in the State Department were marking time. So he had a deep cynicism about a lot of the State Department people. Unfortunately, that was the reality, though. I mean, you were not going to change that. And again, with all of the things that Roosevelt had going on at the time, reform of the institution itself was not something that was high on his list. In terms of his daughter, and I'm not sure whether that was being connected to the millionaires or not. I didn't spend a lot of time. I mean, I actually was criticized criticized again in a Wall Street Journal review for not mentioning the daughter. There is another book only about William Dodd, In the Garden of Beasts, by Erik Larson. That's a terrific book. It's a wonderful book. And it goes into great detail about Martha Dodd. And, she's a fascinating person, really a fascinating person. I mean, I think the only time I mention her is in the context of having had an affair with the author Thomas Wolfe. But, I think she had some effect on her dad. I mean, I think, but I think really what changed his mind were his interactions with the Nazi hierarchy more than anything. I really do. He found them to be evil, and after the night of the Long Knives, when many of the Nazis and other innocent individuals were literally taken out and shot because of this purge that Hitler had instituted. Dodd turned dramatically against Hitler and his cronies, and he knew that these people, had no business running a country. And it's why, in the end, he said, I will never host an event at the embassy for anybody surrounding Hitler, nor will I attend any events where they are present. It made it very difficult, by the way, to be an ambassador, obviously.
A question from Roosevelt House historian Deborah Gardner. She asks, what was Eleanor Roosevelt's relationship, if any, with these characters, meaning the ambassadors? Especially with Long, whose anti-Semitism and anti-refugee policies may have shaped her later work at the United Nations to help Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and refugees right to choose their destinations.
It's good question, really good question. So I don't think she knew William Dodd at all. I'm not sure she even actually ever met him. In terms of Breckinridge Long, there's this wonderful scene that that I record in the book where she and the president are having breakfast together. And this is after Long has been named the Assistant Secretary of State. He is in charge of immigration. He's doing everything he can to keep Jews out of the United States. And he actually has written a memo to a colleague of his, which says, lays out his strategy and says, we can postpone and postpone and postpone. And he's being very effective. And so there's an article in, I believe it's in the Washington Star, where he's been criticized for this, for the stonewalling and for his obstinance. And Eleanor's reading it, and Franklin, I guess, has seen it or is reading the same article. And she looks up at her husband and she says, Franklin, he's a fascist. And Roosevelt's buttering his toast, and he looks up at Eleanor and he says, oh, Eleanor, I just love it. He says, Eleanor, you must not say that. And she says, I'm saying it because it's true. And, she became, and others have written so eloquently about this, but she really became sort of the political conscience for the president in many ways. This was not the only time that she stepped in on a humanitarian issue to try and persuade her husband to do something. And Roosevelt did a couple of things that were helpful in terms of immigration, but this was not a strong suit for the president. Human rights for Franklin Roosevelt were not high on his priority list.
Peter Dixon asks, how many of the ambassadors in major capitals at the time were political appointees rather than professional diplomats, and how did it affect the quality of their advice?
So virtually all of them were political in Europe, at least, and as far as I know, the important ones in Asia as well. And obviously, we didn't have as many ambassadors or as much representation at the time. It was a much smaller department and a much smaller ambassador corps. 700 professional diplomats at the time, with a support staff of 2,500 around the United States and in the United States and around the world. So, now it's 70,000. So it's a very different kind of State Department these days. The one sort of exception was a fellow named George Messersmith, who was actually the consul general in Berlin when Dodd arrived. And he was a career foreign service officer, understood what was happening in Germany right away, and was very outspoken about it. Roosevelt later made him the ambassador to Austria, where again he was outspoken. He was a very fine man and did a very good job as ambassador.
Let's see. Gray Brechen asks, was there any truth in Ambassador Dodd's claim that William Randolph Hearst essentially sold his news service to the German propaganda ministry after meeting with Hitler in Berlin?
And do you know the answer to that?
I think the answer is
I
almost surely no, but
I wouldn't think so, but I wouldn't think so. I mean, look, I think Hearst was sympathetic to the Nazis, and you know, he was very anti-Roosevelt, but I don't know there's any validity to that story.
Joseph Friedman asks if you can talk about Harry Hopkins' visit with Stalin and if and how that laid the groundwork for US-Soviet relations and FDR's relations with Stalin.
It's a good question. So, you know, Roosevelt was, again, felt it very important that Hopkins go to meet with Stalin. The Russians at the time they were deep in the middle of the war with the Germans, with the Nazis, and they were desperate for Lend-Lease themselves. And Roosevelt, you know, really was not able to travel at the time, and Hopkins had done, you know, such a good job with Churchill, so he sent him to meet with Stalin. And again, the two men established a good rapport. Hopkins, I think, was carrying out Roosevelt's wishes, which were to, you know, to find a way to help the Russians, to help the Soviets, because I think he believed that it was very important to have Russian soldiers fighting the Germans, and for them to be as involved as much as possible, and they were, obviously, as opposed to having Americans at the time sacrificing blood and treasure. But he wanted to make sure that they were getting the necessary supplies and weapons that they needed. And, you know, Hopkins came away from the meeting with Stalin, believing that Stalin was very hands-on, that he was, you know, he was not only the supreme leader in the Soviet Union, he was very much the commander-in-chief and the general of the army as well. So it's you know, he doesn't establish the same rapport that he does with Churchill, but the two men, again, I think, trusted each other.
A few people are asking, including Stephen Kalinsky, about why didn't FDR act sooner in removing Breckinridge Long? What does that say about FDR's view of the plight of the Jews in Europe in the 30s and the 40s?
Well, you know, again, I say it's the worst appointment that Roosevelt made in his presidency, as far as I can tell, and that it is forever a stain on the Roosevelt presidency. So I think it's I don't know how to interpret it. I think it's a blind spot, and a terrible blind spot. You know, the one thing I will say is that I think he felt that that there was the issue of German infiltration of the United States in terms of, you know, German spies coming and working in the government and working in corporate America. And this was something that J. Edgar Hoover had raised as a potential, but it just, you know, to keep German Jews out of the United States and those who were fleeing for their lives, it was not. It's a very, very different issue, and I frankly think it's just, again, one of these unfortunate and very blatant blind spots that the president had. You know, you can perhaps come up for a better rationale for the internment of the Japanese Americans, but again, not what I'd call a high point in the Roosevelt presidency.
Let's see. Another question from Katrina Vanden Heuvel. She says, you cite journalist William Scherer. I apologize for the pronunciation. There. William Scherer several times. Who are a few of the other journalists, European or from the United States, who were important to shaping views of war, no war, international relations, and of importance to the ambassadors right, left, and center?
Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time talking about journalists, but and I spend a little bit more time talking about what was going on in the United States in terms of Roosevelt's relationship with the press, but not a lot of time. I mean, again, William Randolph Hearst was Roosevelt's, arch enemy in all of this. And when Ambassador Kennedy was in England and decided that it wasn't a good idea to really become involved in the European war, he granted an interview to the Hearst newspapers, and this infuriated Roosevelt because not only was Kennedy saying the wrong thing and making policy that it was contrary to what Roosevelt believed, but he was giving this interview to a newspaper that loathed him, that loathed the president. And so there was a real problem for President Roosevelt. And but Roosevelt had this sort of extraordinary ability, as you know, to charm the press. There was countless books that talk about that. When he ran for president in 1930, when he ran for re-election in 1940, there were a number of newspapers by that time had turned against him. None of the major papers in the Northeast supported Roosevelt at the time, as far as I know. So he had something of a mixed relationship with the press, but he was a master at communication, and for a long time he charmed them very, very effectively.
Maybe just one more before we wrap up. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
Let's see. Jay Mendez asks, did the State Department embassy staff include intelligence agents, and were they reporting on the German military buildup?
Yeah, so no. I mean, I would say the answer is not. I wouldn't think of it the way we think of it today. Let's put it that way. And in terms of the German rearmament, I mean, that was really something that was communicated in the end by Dodd, and it was an important piece of information that that he conveyed to the president and caused great concern for Roosevelt. But again, the department in those days, it was just a much sort of simpler time. These were diplomats who had gone there, without sort of this overarching view of foreign policy, even really. I mean, I'm not sure that if you polled diplomats in any particular country, that they would have all had sort of the same view of what they were there to do. And so it's we didn't have this kind of highly structured foreign service that we have now, and highly structured foreign international apparatus that exists at the moment. Of course, we didn't have a CIA at the time.
Yeah. Just as a note to that, that's absolutely right. As amazing as it may sound, the United States had really no intelligence service in the 1930s, not until World War II. There were intelligence services appended to the Army and Navy, but there was no CIA, and all the other, national security, all that's a World War II and Cold War development. There's the famous quote from the Secretary of State and then Roosevelt's Secretary of War that gentlemen don't read each other's mail. That was the take on espionage in the State Department in those days.
That's it.
Yeah, well, so I guess that pretty much brings us to the end of the line. As much as it pains me, we have come to the time. It's so fascinating to hear all about this. And thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak here, David. Sorry about the technical glitches, but I think we got it going in the end. So it's really been a pleasure. And thank you very much. And thank you, everybody in the audience. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ben. And again, thanks to the audience, and thanks to Roosevelt House. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good night, all.